a community's trust graph. Like imagine that a DAO, like currently, how does a DAO decide who it's following, like what people it's following, what accounts it's following? But the practice of sort of having a sort of community setting the people they're following is already kind of that's part of the collective attention governance. Like that is a very simple sort of aspect of it.
There's almost like these epistemic hills where it's like this is where most of the belief is, and there's people sort of like little ants going out seeking out new sources of information. Hello. Talking about attention, and I had just asked you about your background in general.
Yeah. So final year, basically final month PhD student in Hebrew University in Israel. And my focus was AI and natural language processing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, somewhere in the middle of my PhD, this was also related to COVID, I kind of fell down rabbit holes of how these big tech AI industries are controlling the data, they're controlling the compute, they're controlling the algorithms, centralized social media platforms. And as I was kind of following the sort of rabbit hole of how this control manifests itself and how they exercise this control, I felt like I was getting led on to this idea of attention and how attention is manifested in sort of digital online environments, like the digital traces of human attention. Because attention is a very human thing, but it also has very specific sort of technicities. This is a word I learned recently. Technicities of attention, like how software reduces attention to code. So I've been very interested in that because it feels like it's a very basic building block of like how we interact with information online. We can go into more detail. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. And I'm also interested in your sort of angle on attention too.
I'm just looking right now. I just pulled up the common sense makers because I'm familiar with both Brad Graff and Daniel from Active Inference Institute. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So after I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of looking at these centralized platforms and getting the sense that things are really, really messed up in sort of online information ecosystems, I started getting interested in decentralization and kind of Web3 areas, and started connecting with people in the Web3 ecosystem. I started working in a company that did tools for DAOs, like DAO Stack, DAO tooling company. And through this, I was exposed to some of the Brad and Daniel are both kind of active in these liminal spaces of decentralized data ownership and that sort of thing. Daniel was really instrumental in my personal journey because, he's an insect intelligent. Like he does research on collective intelligence in ants, and he introduced me to this idea of Stigmergy, which I think was like, if I had to name like the top three concepts that have changed the course of my PhD and probably even more than my PhD, then I think Stigmergy would be one of them.
Yeah, that's the paper that drew my attention the most, which was From Users to Sensemakers on the pivotal role of stigmergic social annotation in the quest for collective sensemaking.
Yeah, that one. So that's a paper with Daniel, and it was kind of through him introducing me to the concept of Stigmergy, and then us trying to sort of synthesize that with, going from insect intelligence to what it means for social media and online information ecosystems.
What's a sort of concise definition of Stigmergy?
Stigmergy is the idea, it's a coordination mechanism, and it's the idea of indirect large-scale coordination that's mediated through environment modifications. So basically, like the textbook example is ant pheromone trails. Mm-hmm. So ants leave pheromone trails, other ants see those trails, react to them, and it's all very local sort of environment modifications, but you get this global, emergent, intelligent collective behavior from those local interactions. And Stigmergy it was coined by a researcher that was trying to understand how those signals and other kinds of signals that insects leave drive this kind of emergent collective intelligence.
And even in those systems, we can sort of hack their behavior by modifying chemicals, making ants think they're dead, making them continue to carry themselves to the dead pile. Um,
Right. There's
except
a
for,
spiral of death, I think.
yeah,
There's also this famous video that shows how it has failure modes, of course. It's not like some kind of fail-safe mechanism. It's just a very powerful example of like when it's functioning normally, it leads to, a lot of very interesting behavior. And I think for me, the sort of aha moment was like platforms in a sense are the ground, right? Like ants, like the ground that the ants put the pheromones on. And it just got me to think that the platforms are like messing up our stigmergy. Like
yeah,
the signals are amplified in ways that we don't understand. We don't even control really what happens with the pheromones. So it'd be almost like if you took an ant colony and started messing around with the properties of the soil and stuff. Like you said, you'd cause a lot of crazy failures, and it feels like we're kind of starting at that place right now. We try to have to figure out what does even healthy stigmergic infrastructure look like for our communications.
and it's evolved quite a bit since the beginning of the internet, from intuition, which might be something like a 10 star scale, to just, well, we don't have the space on the page for this, and most users are only doing the extremes, so let's just go to like to dislike, to now they're actively removing the dislike. And you know ants can't really design their system, but we have that freedom. But it does seem almost like it's more reactive on our end to market forces at this point, where there isn't a lot of applied intelligence in the design of those signals that we're tracking. And we've had like at least I think 5 years since the problems started to really bubble up and become readily apparent. But there's a sort of desire to have them all be managed in the background passively, rather than introducing some sort of active mechanism. Did you want to talk about your just paper in general and what you sort of have found from the signals that we're tracking, and maybe sort of the differences between like passive tracking of users versus active tracking, which is sort of harder to get users to do, but might be more valuable, or sometimes even they might not even know their own self that well?
Yeah, for sure. You brought up a lot of really sort of interesting points that we can explore. I think so. Talking about this kind of passive active distinction, and yeah, maybe you asked about the paper kind of more broadly. So
Mm-hmm.
the paper is a really short paper. It's basically just an extended abstract. It's kind of a call to attention. We thought of it like it's trying to say, hey, this is a thing we really need to be looking at. We're not really thinking about our relation to data in this way. And this is kind of, if I had to really summarize it, I would say we have this kind of metaphor of, data is the new oil.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about how all these social media companies and platforms in general have managed to capture oil, mine our oil, and harvest it and extract it and convert it to gold. So there's this kind of pipeline of data, kind of it's some kind of oil, and they extract it and they turn it into gold. And this paper is kind of trying to invite an alternative interpretation where data it's not oil that we're just kind of the sort of remains of like dead animals. It's more like these are our markers that we're like data is stigmergy. It kind of invites us to be much more active participants. Like it invites us to think of each of us as like it's kind of a neuron in a collective brain, and we're part of this collective intelligence network. So it's a whole other relation to data. It's like you're very like ideally, right? No one is going to do this in the beginning at least, but you're very mindful of the traces you're leaving online. What am I sharing? With who am I sharing it? How am I sharing it? And what we talked about in the paper is there's kind of two parts to this. One is sort of our individual mindset shift that like we become, instead of like seeing ourselves as just passive, doom scrolling users, we're more active. We coined the term sense makers. So it's kind of like we're trying to evoke sort of the hacker ethos, where the hackers are like people that take ownership over the code they're producing, and they create their own tools to create the digital spaces they want to live in, basically. So yeah, sense makers are also creating their own information ecosystems, and they have ownership over those tools, and it's kind of trying to evoke that active sense of ownership over the data you're sharing. And that's one part. So that's the individual aspect. But we also recognize that individuals are ultimately very limited in what they can do. So even if you decide today, I don't want to be a user anymore, I want to be a sense maker.
Yeah.
You're set up for failure because the infrastructure is so lacking, and it's so there's such powerful infrastructure arrayed against you that these platforms have. You're very limited in what you can do by yourself, and
I
there needs to
constantly
be
fight
an
against the
infrastructure shift.
algorithm. Just
Exactly.
yesterday, I went through, for probably the nth time, just going through YouTube and saying, don't recommend this, don't recommend this, don't recommend this. But it just leaks in over time where you get into this passive deterministic cognition kind of mode where it's like, I can't actively be controlling my attention all the time.
Right.
And I really sort of feel that attention is it's kind of like breathing, in that it can be both active and it can be automatic. And most of the time it's falling into that automatic space. And there are sort of boundaries on the extent to which you can control your attention. So it really is important that we have these mechanisms of what I think you called in the paper or somewhere, like the governance of attention itself. Because that is defining so much of the public discourse, is what is going to work itself through those filters. And it seems after all this time, either there's not a motivation to correct for the sensationalism that guides our attention, or they haven't found a way that still manages to keep people on site. Like there's sort of a conflicting optimization plane there where you have to have people on site, and to do that, you have to get people's attention. And there might be some desires from some of the people working on those teams to align that attention with some better outcomes. But if you aren't going to extract it, then TikTok's going to come along with their insanely powerful algorithm, which I can't even leave that installed on my phone because it's so powerful. And the models that they sort of have of me now on different platforms are sort of getting scarily accurate, which is, it's just bringing up things that I'm almost actively thinking about at the same time. It's becoming an extension of ourselves without any control, but we should have some level of rights over the direction and flow of our attention stream.
Yes, this is very much. So there's a lot of things happening because, like you say, the platforms have so much data over you that they can, and so much data collectively that they've amassed from all the users that they track, that they can build really good predictive models. But in fact, those models are kind of they're very dangerous in a way because they're not models that are optimized for anything other than leaving you on the site. Like they're not optimized, for example, for your long-term intellectual or emotional development or something like that. Mm-hmm. What does a model of sort of attention governance look like that does that? Like what is a feed algorithm that sort of, or a platform that is trying to promote this kind of intellectual growth? What does that look like? It probably looks completely different than what we have right now. Yeah. So they have a very certain kind of control that's very effective at the very short term, and that's all they need, because they're sort of exploiting our worst weaknesses to leave us on the site, and that's all that interests them. So one of the papers we draw on heavily in that paper is it's not a paper, it's a book called Stand Out of Our Light, and it's Freedom and Resistance in the Attention Economy. It's by a former Google ethicist. I think his name is James Williams. And he has this meme that he calls From Attention to Intention. And it's about like this kind of passive to active mindset where these technologies are purposefully sort of leaving us in this passive mindset. They're entrenching us. They're digging us deeper into the passive mindset because we're more predictable in the passive mindset. As active
Yeah.
users, we're much less predictable, much less controllable. They have much less that they can kind of even help us with. It becomes something completely different. Like when the kind of tools we're looking at, for example, are like tools for thought. Those are something that are more close to sort of the active like sense maker tools, and not like a doom scrolling feed like Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
So they have very good reasons to want to leave us in this kind of passive domain.
So you've mentioned doom scrolling a couple of times, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of dopamine in modulating attention. The sort of common way that people think about dopamine is like it's a reward that you get a little hit of when you get something good, which is not really true. It's more related to anticipation and the modulation of attention over time and goal oriented behavior. And Asa Raskin at the Center for Humane Technology developed the Infinite Scroll. And there's sort of like this always an anticipation that there's some other piece of novelty below the fold. And so it's not like that we're getting a rush or a massive hit of it. It's just messing up that entire loop where the people who are most sort of addicted to social media actually have much lower levels from what I've read recently of dopamine in their system, but it's still that fundamental loop that is modulating and controlling the behavior. Like individually, what do you have to say, or what like thoughts can you contribute to the notion of it at a neurochemical level, or at like an individual level?
Yeah. So yeah, the dopamine aspect is quite interesting, and I'm not an expert um, on that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
It does. I mean, I feel like there's this kind of general. I think reward is much more complex probably than dopamine. And I know there's like other signals. I wish I could pull up the names, but there's all kinds of reward that we get. And, dopamine is just one of them. And it's kind of, again, they're
Yeah.
like hacking our reward system to go after something that is going to sort of reliably keep us engaged, but not necessarily good for us. Just like, sugar is going to keep you like, yeah, make some food sugary. It'll keep the person, like, it'll keep a kid happy. But
What does a design where our flows of attention are reoriented towards the self look like, where we still have access to community, where we still have access to information, where we still have access to novelty? Because novelty is good, learning things is good. It's just that there's sort of a reduction down to the most base common denominator in a lot of cases, and also the emergence of just hyper targeted um, content per individual, which is just like it's just scratching the perfect thing that you can't fight. So, in your mind, what is a better design?
yeah, so I think one sort of overarching principle is diversity. So it's not going to be one feed. It's a lot of different ways to interact with information, and people have a lot of different styles too. That some people prefer like a visual layout. Maybe they want like to see a graph, and they kind of would explore a graph. Some people, it's actually easier. Yeah, maybe some people it is actually easier to have the feed, um, but having the ability to sort of shift in between different kinds of modes of interacting with information, I think that is really important to get you out of the sort of rut of doom scrolling. There's a nice tweet by I think Visa on Twitter. He's got Visa. I'm not sure the last name, but talking about sort of this metaphor. We used to have the metaphor of surfing the web. It was like a very active thing. Like we used
Yeah.
to like explore between different websites and follow the hyperlinks, and it was much more of sort of this kind of journey as opposed to this kind of very passive doom scrolling. And I think bringing back some of that energy of like letting the user do more stuff. Like, so you might like have you're on this on ramp, like the highway of, the feed is like a highway of information, but like it invites you to leave it actually and go off and explore some rabbit hole and like do some deep reading as well, because the feed is
Yeah.
ultimately just for like, snippets of information, but it would send you out to like, to off ramps to like, here's like this enchanted forest of a lot of like deeper content that you like read stuff. And
Yeah.
And right now I think there's a lot of value that we can have in making that kind of making those parts, the deeper content, interesting. So I can give you a few examples of things I'm aware of. Um, One is like more synchronous interactions. So, for example, you're on a web page and you have the ability to sort of see that your friends were on a web page, or say friends, or some community of people that you're like, you respect or are interested in, and they like have an invitation or like a standing invitation for someone to, join like a live session, like to talk about some, if it's a blog post or scientific paper or something like that. You could almost imagine like a Tinder over like web pages. That like I saw this paper, I swipe right to have like to indicate that I'd be interested in like doing a live session over it, and then someone else goes and swipes it right, and then it connects you. Obviously, you need a little more filtering to get the noise out, but that kind of sort of drawing us into deeper connection. That's kind of the example I'm trying to bring here. So every web page can be this kind of invitation for some kind of deeper connection with another human being, and this sort of each web page is basically like a I like to think of it as like a Shelling point. The people
Mm-hmm.
use like a meeting place. Like we're meeting each other on these web pages, and that's why I'm so interested in the idea of like Stigmergy as these trails we're leaving. Because right now we're sort of all navigating the information unaided. We're like, if you're on a web page, you have no idea if your friends were there, what they thought of it, or if anyone else was there. You really don't know any of that information. And by bringing that information to the surface and letting it actually be leveraged and used for connection, then it's a whole different experience because like yeah, all your surfing, all your actions, all your browsing actions can sort of contribute to connecting you to people and finding more interesting information. So yeah, that's kind of one example. I mean, there's others that we can talk about, but
What is sort of an ideal signal or set of signals that are stigmergic signals that we can optimize in or towards? Like the word like and its semantics is very bland. And there might be some people say, well, we're optimizing towards well-being perhaps, or something like that, and you could have self-reported well-being, but even then there's sort of this time preference towards the short term, when real transformation often takes longer periods of time, and there are trials that we have to go through often to get to a more stable sort of plane of well-being. And so there can be just as many problems from directly optimizing self-reported well-being. So what in your mind are better signals that we can provide to an algorithm to help direct our attention in a healthier way?
yeah, I think there's two parts to this question. One part is the sort of what are the signals we're leaving, like, and you kind of raise this question about like, is light signal enough? Is that too sort of reducing too much into one sort of one dimension? So that's like one aspect. What are the signals we're leaving? And the second aspect is how are we leveraging those signals with AI or other algorithms to guide us through information. So those are the two parts I would say. And then I think for each part, there's we can talk about it. But for example, for the like part, yeah, I think totally. I mean, there's a lot of room here for innovations and sort of expanding the range of expression, right? Like just like Facebook, they decided instead of a like, now you can do like 5 emojis over a post,
Yeah.
right? So they gave you more latitude for expression. But again, this is not anything that they designed for like improving your epistemic environment. They just they figured it's going to help keep people on the site. So I think actually recently someone introduced me to an idea from the Less Wrong. I think they have something called epistemic statuses. It's emojis basically related to like epistemic status. So you like, this was insightful, this was too complicated, this made me laugh, or whatever. All these
Yeah.
different things. So it's basically inviting people to sort of express their a more full range of emotion, and with the knowledge that that data is actually going to be used later, and not in ways that I think trying to get people more in the loop of like how this data is actually being used. Like I don't want it to be like today where I don't really have such a good idea of how the like is used. When I make the like on something, I don't really understand how it's contributing to the sort of
Yeah.
algorithm. I don't have any way to influence it. But imagine like you're kind of partner with, you're part of the, you're creating data. Like, so you're saying this made me laugh, this made me cry, this was insightful. And later, then you have also the ability to kind of configure the algorithm and tell it, whatever, I'm in the mood for something that'll make me think right now, or I'm in the mood for something that'll make me laugh. And just by that invitation, it kind of shifts you in this mindset of like, okay, I have to set an intention now. I'm not just like doom scrolling, but I'm actually like, I have to be more active. I have to think, what do I want to see right now? And that already kind of puts you in the more sense maker space and less in the user space.
Well, there's an interesting sort of transformation from, I think, models built on discrete values to something more less quantitative and more qualitative from the emergence of these large language models. In theory, you could write a textual description of what you expect to be filtered out of your stream, and that can be applied at every single step. But even with those large language models, if you dive into the reinforcement learning with human feedback, the signal that they're optimizing towards is something like quality or relevance. And there's a context in which the people are evaluating what is quality or relevant, and part of it is that they're being paid to do that. And they have sort of the larger motivation, so they might not be inherently honest. And the second part of that is really, I think, the time preference. I think our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, almost sort of flowing into this sort of singularity. And if we don't find a way to stretch that attention out further, we're almost like it's almost like we're losing our agency to self direct. And so,
Yeah, I
in
haven't thought
my
about that.
work,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
do
Yeah.
you have a thought in your mind? I'd love to hear it.
No, yeah, you finished that. I'll just give you an example of an app that is kind of trying to lengthen the attention span, but we can get back to it.
What app is that?
This is an app that some colleagues of mine are working on. It's called Gather, and the basic idea is just to create sort of a campfire around some social media, or not around social media, around a media object. Like it could be a blog post or any media on the internet. And what does that mean? It just sort of invitation to gather around some kind of some kind of media object, and then have a discussion about it that is sort of structured. They have sort of a way for it's basically, I mean, a video chat room that has a little more some affordances for like people can mark sort of moments in the chat that were insightful, and there's some like structured prompts to get people talking, and there's an AI that helps like summarize what happened in the end, so you're going to get this kind of summary artifact that you can go out with. But the whole thing, I mean, is just kind of, I see it as an invitation to lengthen your attention span. These things are actually very pleasurable. Like you spend an hour talking with people, and if you curate the right set of people, I mean, it's really interesting, and you're going to get a lot of insight. And it's not like, yeah, there's so many boring Zoom calls we've all been on, but if you do it right, then it's actually really interesting. And yeah, that's kind of just a practice of widening our attention. I totally agree with you. I think that like super important, and there's just like so many ways that we need to explore to start doing that, because every person has their own preference, and there'll be a lot of, again, diversity here.
There is like also a disconnect between how we use the platforms and what we expect out of their behavior. The curation of any algorithm takes a lot of work, and often is like on Facebook, it'll be like going down a long list of checkboxes for categories specifically. And I don't find it to be a particularly useful approach. Um, I've been posting in the last few days quite a bit about forethought, which is part of this cognicist framework. And it's sort of a protocol for sense making. And it's built around the concept of belief staking, where individually staked claims or beliefs are tied to long-term reputation or amplification of your voice, meaning that there would be a distinction online between a passive post, which is that you don't particularly expect this to affect you in any way, and a staked post. And a staked post will be tied to your reputation, will affect, particularly in the context of what you're saying in the future, whether you say that again. For example, if you're a nutritional blogger and you tend to post all of these things, which later many scientific studies come out and contradict that. If you're continuing to try and post in that context, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the algorithms to continue to amplify that content just because a lot of people at that moment liked it. And so there has to be a longer term time preference in the algorithms themselves beyond just what people are doing or thinking right now. Even in a lot of the conflict that's going on right now, the primary thing that I notice is just even waiting 12 hours, there will be better information. And by that time, it's already spread through the internet, and there's no real mechanism to go back to each of the people who might have received that misinformation and grab their attention again and be like, by the way, that thing that you just posted to everything, you should go back and check or correct that. Because it's not gonna always be 12 hours. Sometimes it's gonna take 3 months. Sometimes it's gonna take 3 years. Sometimes it's gonna take a decade before we know the error of where we placed our attention. And sometimes myths about various truths get so baked into the collective zeitgeist that it takes just a really, really, really long time to break through that. For like example, the dopamine thing, which is where people think that either dopamine or serotonin are just sort of a reward drug that you just sort of get a hit of whenever something good happens. And there's like a lot of different wives' tales that sort of fit our cognition in a way that requires us to have to think less. I'm really enamored with Daniel's work with active inference and the notion of the brain doesn't want to use a lot of energy. And if you have a hierarchy of beliefs and some piece of information comes along that violates some base foundation of that, there would have to be a lot of rewiring to get that flow back into that, like a chugging engine, a chugging optimal engine that is like a person who is happy and good. And so it's very easy, I think, for whatever passive mechanism that exists in the brain to reject something, even if it's very logical, even if it's very clearly presented, because you can't just plug a piece of information into it and just like put it on top like a Christmas tree. Like there will
Yes.
inherently need to do some rewiring, and you'll have to think over a lot of different things. You'll have to reevaluate and restructure, and that would just take too much effort. And so there also is this process of sort of synaptic pruning for most people as we age, which is trying to whittle down those complexities to get sort of a baked in model that is going to serve us for until we're like 35, not until we're like 75. And you really
Yeah, I
have
just
to
passed that.
actively challenge your mind with a certain type of information flow to keep the plasticity up.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, you raised like five different points that we could dive into, but yeah, just this last one, I think of the idea of like this cognitive effort and like meeting people sort of where they're at cognitively. I mean, you would think that this would be something that would be of like supreme interest and importance to like funding agencies or science, but it's like there's very little, I feel like, actual research being done here. And one of the reasons is because the data that you would need kind of, you would need like a lot of social media data and YouTube. Like YouTube could be a treasure trove if you had access to all the trajectories people are making through the platform over time. Like that would be a treasure trove, right? But we don't have access to that. So and there's probably like it's such a if it's a blue ocean. There's really not much information I think about like how what do those cognitive trajectories look like? What does it look like? The intellectual growth of someone along with their emotional growth and all those things. Zach Stein is another guy who talks about this a lot. Like I don't know if you're familiar with Zach, but he's got a lot of really interesting sort of research and thinking about like the future of education. And he talks about
Mm-hmm.
these kind of trajectories through information and YouTube and other platforms. So I totally agree with you. And I kind of feel like part of what we've been talking about earlier. We talked about these epistemic statuses and the different kind of reactions and expanding that range. So I think part of what that is should be like tailored and designed to do is really help us sort of record our trajectories through content online. And
Yeah.
if we're all like if it was sort of a normative practice that people would kind of do their thinking out in the open, and we'd all be sharing this kind of data, I'm sure you could do really interesting stuff in terms of like tailoring people. Like for example, I'm at this misinformation story, but I'm coming at it from I don't know, very whatever. Right wing perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
the next content that I maybe would want to see is not the same as someone who's coming at the story from the other side of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to have those kind of trajectories based on other people, I think would allow you to address some of these issues. And I wanted to say something about the earlier part that you talked about. This idea of kind of you called it sort of the staking of reputation,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is also another really interesting topic that kind of ties into another. This is kind of more of my recent research related to scientific publishing and like there's a practice now in scientific publishing called nano publishing, and the idea is to instead of producing like a paper like a large PDF as your research output, you can actually start thinking of much smaller units of research. Basically, a tweet size assertion can also be a unit of scientific knowledge. That's
Yeah.
what they call nano publications. And you can think of these nano publications in a sense. They're almost like it's just like a tweet, but it has a little more structure, and it also comes with like the staking of reputation that science brings with it. So science has already kind of been exploring this way of like epistemic communication, sort of right. It's already been doing that kind of thinking about like there is some issue of reputation baked into science. There's the idea of retraction. So you mentioned how, when something becomes disproved, then there's methods of sort of rolling back that research. So that's the idea of the retraction in science.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you talked about the nutritionist that maybe published stuff and then that turned out to be false, then how would people get notified? So science kind of has a mechanism for doing it. Again, it's like way,
Mm-hmm.
way too old school, and it needs to be, revamped for like the fast pace of current social media. But you could almost imagine that, if we were sort of adopting some of these practices, you might get like, let's say, you took some, you tagged some piece of misinformation. You said, this was really insightful for me. And that would kind of automatically kind of trigger this kind of watch for retractions. And if there was a retraction on that piece, then you kind of get a notification. And it wouldn't matter if it's, a day after or a month later or a year later. And I totally agree with you that this is the kind of infrastructure we need to be thinking about. Like people interact with information, and currently on social media, it's this kind of ephemeral stream. You're never going to see that tweet again. But
Mm-hmm.
in a new system, it should be something that's not ephemeral. It's if you reacted to it very strongly, then we should take that in consideration and account for it later.
You can also link that back into sort of the trajectories of thought or trajectories of research, where it's like if something goes out there into the world and bakes into sort of the priors of like these number of researchers and contributes their work, they're building upon this, first principle. And then making a publishing about that, and you can sort of see how that information creates flows of reconstructions in different people's brains, because ultimately what happens is there's this a wiring of the physical structures of our brains that we don't have that much control over. And yet it affects so much of how our attention is being guided. If you want to break an addiction, it takes an intense level of application of will to create a new structure that will guide the flow of your attention in um, in a healthier way. Um,
Would you say that is like information that you're lacking, or sometimes it's not information? Sometimes it's actually like embodied practice that you need, or maybe sometimes it's
yeah,
a combination of both.
it's like how the information within yourself is structured and oriented to each other. I mean, two people can believe like 10 separate facts equally and have that same cognitive structure produce a very different belief about us, the same article, because they're not always necessarily relating in the same way. Each art, like architecture of mind, uh, is very, very different, and we don't really have a lot of good tools for how we construct that. um, so before we started recording, you were asking a little bit about my background, and I think I could sort of zoom back to sort of the individual level and talk a little bit about my experience with attention. Because when I was 5, a teacher said, "Okay, this student is having trouble paying attention," and they had read um, or heard from somebody about the concept of attention deficit, and so for the better part of 30 years on and off, I've been on some sort of stimulant. Um, but it's not like there is ever a lack of attention. Our attention is always somewhere. It's whether or not the placement of that attention aligns with our identity and aligns with the identity of the community. So I was never, for example, asked about my social deficits. I was primarily asked about my attention in school, whether I was able to focus on, math and reading. And a huge aspect that went by the wayside was my capacity to create friendships, to create connections, which is such an important part of being a human. So I advanced in my grades really quickly, and I was able to learn very quickly, but they didn't really understand that it was not a cognitive failing on my behalf. Like, they thought I couldn't read, which was, I was just not interested in the things that they were presenting to me. As I grew and as I've gotten older, around 25, I had sort of, well, with the ADD, I had a manifestation of like hyperfocus, right? Which is very helpful at times. If I
Did
need to
that come with like
study,
medication, or was it independent of like things you were
independent of that.
taking?
If I am interested in something, if I want to do it, there has always been an intense level of attention. It's when I feel a need to place attention in a particular direction that I just don't want to, that it becomes very challenging. And so hyperfocus can be very positive. It's very connected with flow for me, and the effortless type of cognition. And then around 25, I developed OCD, which is the opposite type of hyperfocus, which you'll have a thought which, for whatever reason, makes you feel uncomfortable or doesn't agree with your identity in some reason, and then you just can't stop thinking about it. And it's almost gravitational, and it's almost like magnetism, right? Where my consciousness, my awareness will be drawn physically to thoughts, and then they get into an orbit. And once I'm in that orbit around that thought, all of the cognition happens in relationship to that root. And if I don't have the momentum to escape that trajectory, it's going to start to reshape the fundamental architecture. So my entire life has been in relationship to attention. And when I look out to a lot of my friends now in this world who are suddenly in their mid 30s getting prescribed Adderall for the first time in their life, I try to explain to them, you probably don't have ADD. It's just that the information architecture that we have has deconstructed our capacity to self-regulate, and there are expectations about where you are to place your attention that don't necessarily align with your identity. So I just said a lot. So I'll just let you sort
Yeah.
of say whatever you
Yeah,
think in relation to that.
yeah, I think it's fascinating. Um, I have done a little bit of reading about ADD, and something that I remember really caught my attention was the sort of importance of environments. Like if you put, take a kid with ADD out of the classroom and let's say, I don't know, take them to some like, I don't know, be out in nature or playing with animals or something like that. It's like a completely different, they could be completely different, and you wouldn't see any attention problems at all, maybe,
Yeah.
completely normal. Um, so it feels almost like there's, and you said this piece about you felt the struggle to sort of force your attention where it didn't want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like, yeah, that feels really like an important piece, because you get a sense in this kind of industrial era we're in this kind of, culture is the ratchet of like creating machines out of humans, right? It's like the ratchet is turning. We get ever since the industrial era where, we had the manual laborers on the production lines, and more we're kind of being coupled more tightly. The gig workers in the Amazon warehouses, or the drivers, or right, we're kind of becoming part of a machine, and the machine is kind of dictating our attention regime. And that's why as kids, they start early with that, the sort of indoctrination. As kids, you're expected, read this book, write this thing, answer this, very sort of rigid kind of regimes of attention. And it seems like, some people maybe are good at that. And it almost feels like there's kind of probably a cultural self-selection. Like the people that are good at sort of overriding their attention and kind of, forcing it to do things, even if they're not interested in them, probably have an advantage. Whereas people that might have like really great focus in their flow state, but it's hard for them to kind of force their attention where it doesn't want to be, are at a disadvantage in this kind of culture. To me, it's just like, I hear this and I'm like, we need so many different kinds, and such a diversity of like learning environments, and not this kind of one monoculture that we have, which seems so wrong, and does so much damage to people, and makes people feel like they're sick or something, but the environment is sick. And we definitely have this culture of like blaming the individual as opposed to blaming the system. So it ties into a lot of those things as well. And I wanted to. There's a term that I learned recently, and this is a really interesting line of research called attunement. Like your attunement, your the quality of being attuned to something. It comes from like there's now a philosophy and ethics of attention. I recently learned, so I've been following some research around this, and this idea of like where your attention is at is kind of, there's moral vices and virtues associated with that, and it's an individual level, but it also is like a societal level, because a society might be ignoring something really important, and an individual might be ignoring things that are really important. And we need to start talking about that, especially in an age of information overload, that we're all like drenched in information, and we have to kind of make sense of it. So sort of the attunement to information to me seems like it's kind of a virtue we never knew was important, but nowadays it's like, I would like, it's becoming so important so quickly, and we can kind of see how oftentimes I feel like when I look at people these days, I feel like that's one of the, beyond like left and right in politics, I feel like there's this quality of attunement, like who is attuned to like what is relevant in this current moment. I've even, the person that wrote this piece about attunement, she even claims that like the woke is basically like, she characterizes it as a quality of attunement. So like wokeness is a kind of attunement to certain kinds of moral, I guess, like transgressions or whatever. But it's kind of a quality of attention, and it does sound like that. I mean, intuitively, we can kind of hear that in the word. And again, these things are such like like no one has heard about any of this stuff, but it feels like, I mean, we were talking about attention, and I can just see that attention is gathering attention. People are becoming more interested in all these different aspects of attention. So I'm I think that's like at least hopeful. But yeah, there's definitely sort of very little sort of broad, from the mainstream kind of to these topics.
I think attention is also deeply connected to trust and reputation when it comes to sense making. If you have a distribution of potential voices that you could listen to on any particular topic, um, which one are you going to focus into? And there's also this aspect that like attention itself is inherently extractive because you cannot really consume the whole of an information, so it needs to take out the parts. It needs to like a little scalpel cut it into pieces that fit into the existing architecture bit by bit and construct it up into a compressed representation of
Do you mean
what
it's
you're
like a scarce
seeing.
resource? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yes.
Because yeah, okay.
And so I think moving forward, if we want to talk about collaborative sense making, where it's not just you're setting for each individual the goal of the algorithm, but you're saying we're part of a group, we're part of a DAO, and we have these particular goals. And so each individual might have their own attention goals, but there can be a larger set of goals that have been defined collectively that will affect the information stream that each person is getting. And they have the freedom and right to choose to attend to parts of it and it can adjust accordingly. But I think that we need to have better systems that are akin to trust or a trust attention for various topics. And if we don't want to place attention to this institutional thing where, for example, like I don't have the credentials really to get anything that I would write, any research paper I would write into anywhere that could get the type of attention that it needs, even if that research is far ahead of other researchers. So there are plenty of things that I have written about publicly that 3 or 4 years later, I'll pull up an article and it will say, we are the first person to ever do this. And I'm like, well, how the hell am I supposed to what is my recourse here to say, well, actually, my attention was here far beyond yours? I do think we have in language models uh, an incredible capacity to assess at scale the semantics of what people are putting out into the world when those voices might move against the crowd at first, and then as time moves forward, it becomes aligned, right? There's almost like these epistemic hills where it's like this is where most of the belief is, and there's people sort of like little ants going out seeking out new sources of information, and over time those hills sort of just move and sit on top of the hill, that ant, and that ant isn't brought to the top of the pile. It's like it's covered up by everybody else, and I think that's sort of the mechanism that we need to move into, which is, well, there is the trajectory of the individual ants over time, and there's a trajectory of the larger collective whole. And if we are measuring the trajectory of thought, of research, of all of these different voices, at each moment we can sort of shift or distribute attention in the algorithm relative to the past, relative to, well, what was this trajectory of these individual ants? Was this an ant that was just tied up in what everybody else is saying? Are they always at the peak of the bell curve? Or are there some voices that are just consistently ahead of the curve? They're also saying things that people don't want to hear at the moment that need to be heard. And then we can take that as a signal to say this voice, even though it's not getting a lot of likes right now, consistently they're ahead of the curve. So we should inject what they're saying into the data stream, even if people aren't liking it. I feel like that was
Yeah, yeah,
pretty
yeah,
solid metaphor.
yeah. I really like the sort of the ants and the bell curve. We can kind of feel this intuitively. Again, I think having the data out there would allow us to do a lot of really interesting. There's just so much you can do. Actually, I mean, you can really turn those intuitions into something practical if you have more data about people's this kind of cognitive trajectories through information, which we don't have right now. But
Yeah.
I think we kind of feel it intuitively. And I want to give an example of, I think now, at least this has been my experience. Again, we're talking about sort of the war right now in Israel, Gaza. And in general, I think we've seen this in all these kind of world events that oftentimes there's these people on Twitter that you follow and they will never get it into mainstream news. You just won't see their voice. And they could be saying things that are incredibly important. I found this from my personal experience that I look at news now, but it's only like one part and not even a very significant part of my sort of information intake. Like I much more trust different sources, like personal people that I follow, and I get information that I would never be exposed to on the mainstream. And it really freaks me out because I figure like, okay, this person has, let's say, 300 followers or 400 followers or whatever. Most of the world is not seeing what this person is saying. I think it's incredibly important. I have no way to sort of convey that, and it's never going to make it into the mainstream. And yeah, collective attention, like you say, is going to be misattuned. It's not going to be. It's going to be missing very important information, and we don't have any tools to sort of account for that. So yeah, it's a huge gap in our current information infrastructures, and that's part of the reason we talked about these kind of the different stigmergic failure modes, like the death spirals, all these things. I mean, and we see this, mainstream media or people that control platforms can control when Elon Musk tweets something, he appears at the top of the pile. So like, yeah, we totally know that the information streams that we're currently exposed to are very prone to all kinds of failures. So yeah, so that was just kind of the point about like the person on Twitter that tweeted something and doesn't make it into the mainstream. I think it's interesting. So okay, so this is kind of circling back to what you said early in the beginning about sort of the attention distribution, like collective attention distribution, and how like a DAO might manage that kind of thing. And this is some kind of research I've been working on in Common Sensemakers with Brad DeGraff. So this is his idea. He's got this idea of trust graphs, and a few people have been talking about this idea. So a community's trust graph, like imagine that a DAO, like currently, how does a DAO decide who it's following, like what people it's following, what accounts it's following? But the practice of sort of having a sort of community setting the people they're following is already kind of that's part of the collective attention governance. Like that is a very simple sort of aspect of it. And so a DAO, yeah, could, right now we don't see this really happening, but it's kind of my dream to see sort of a decentralized, collectively controlled social media account. It would have like the whole API of Twitter you could imagine is like decentralized and like voting or whatever, collective decision mechanism you want to use, so that yeah, the likes that this thing makes, the retweets, the follows, all these things would be sort of a collective decision. And then you'd kind of have this ability to sort of share I think it'd be an interesting experiment. I've been thinking about this for a while, but this idea of setting a trust graph, I think, is part of the collective attention, because yeah, the when you follow someone, you're basically signaling, you're saying, my attention is on this person. I want to see more information from them. So it's a very simple act of kind of expressing this kind of attention.
And I think that, I'm interested in trust a lot, and I've looked at a lot of different systems that have some sort of trust layer, and usually it's pretty much a wholesale sort of this person or this source of information is trustworthy or not, and that doesn't really track in the real world. Like trust, like I trust my doctor for things related to healthcare, but I don't trust them to
exactly.
fix
like
my
politics
sink
or something. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Like, so there is sort of a contextual aspect that we can get into where if somebody says a particular thing because it can be placed within a semantic context using natural language processing, that the algorithm can make a decision about whether or not to amplify that voice in that particular context. And that reputation doesn't need to be tied to a direct trust rating of another person. It can be related to just their trajectory, basically.
right.
And it could be inferred from that trajectory, such that you can have people who are not part of an institution who might be saying something ahead of that curve. And over years, maybe that institution catches up, and then they start saying, okay, we are the first people to ever write this, but you can just go back. We have the whole record.
Right.
we have that whole record of all of those claims over time, and we can find the earliest representation of an idea. We can find the provenance of cognition where it's like, this is the first little seed, and this seed got into maybe these three minds, and it mutated a little bit, and then that seed transferred from these minds to these minds to these minds, and slowly as it worked through the collective mind space, and started to grow into various different people's minds until it reaches a critical breaking point where suddenly goes viral and it says, oh, this new article has come out that says and proves definitively this new piece of information. We can track back over time and find non-institutional sources of information, those people with only 300 sources, or I mean 300 followers, and really lift up their voice, but only in the context within which they have proven themselves. And I do think that it's very important for that, a part of that aspect, to separate passive posting, meaning I'm just fucking around with I need something stronger to indicate to the algorithm. I need a mechanism that says, hold the fuck up, you need to pay attention to this over time, and you need to continually assess relative to this post. And maybe I'll discover that I'm wrong down the line, but I don't have that mechanism. I don't have a mechanism other than just repeating content multiple times. And even then, like, it's based off of my basic understanding of how these algorithms work, and not that I actually have access to how they really work. I don't know particularly how the Twitter algorithm distributes information. I know that when I post something, if it's like a schizo Buddhist non-dualist post, like very quickly the people who are associated with that are alerted to that. But is that not just a bubble of misinformation where it's only presenting the people who are already in the similar part of the semantic field? How do we push beyond that and give people the tools to say, okay, this is this is a smellier scent marker, and I'm choosing to leave this smellier scent marker, and you should smell this smell because it's very important right now. And it won't just get covered up. It won't just get buried in like the millions of grains of sand of other posts that are there, and it can actually bubble to the top of I guess the collective mind space when it is actually necessary. Yeah, I mentioned earlier the forethought dialectic, which is part of the Cognisys tool set, and each sort of claim that you would stake has two spectrums along which they're associated with vote, which is, I guess you could call it verity and valence. And it's verity is like the spectrum of certainty with a full confidence that a piece of information is false on one end, and the center just complete uncertainty, and on the other end a full confidence that the piece of information is true. And then there's valence, which is it good or bad or neutral, with the same type of spectrum within it. And the notion being that we need to balance between hearing things that are true that we don't want to hear, that may not be good, and we do want to minimize sort of like the misinformation that we get, even if it makes us feel good over time. So there's sort of a balance in that vector of which direction we want to go in society. And I think markets, for example, really lean into the valence of want, short-term want. Does this make me feel good? And not so much on, is this true? Or and in particular, not, we don't have a society that leads us into those degrees or leads us into uncertainty. The last thing that I want to bring up is maybe not directly semantically related, but it's just bubbling around in my head, which is the degrees of freedom that we have in our attention. Because I kind of think that our cognition is sort of in this semantic field, And I know from my experience that I can run from thoughts a little bit, but they're still somewhere out there. And eventually they'll come or they'll bubble back up, and I'll have to deal with whatever that thought is trying to tell me until I let it sit in the center of my attention for a while and just let it. I call it like the thought needs to feel heard, or it won't stop. Even if it's like a crazy thought, I just have to sit with it and be like, okay. And so there is like, I would say that we have at least the ability to move away from a thought. So there's sort of a directionality to the lens of attention in our mind. But the very underrated other aspect of attention is the widening or the closing of the lens. And I really feel like that's what's lacking in a lot of the discourse right now. That a lot of what people are saying, if they just zoomed out and took a broader picture and then sort of zoomed back in again, it would alleviate a lot of the emotional based posting that the algorithm seems to love. There's a tight relationship with our personal relationship with attention and how we are able to modulate it, and the algorithmic aspect of it. So we both need to be able to work on the larger algorithmic aspect of our attention modulation and gain the knowledge about how we can strengthen the muscle that allows us to direct our attention within our own minds. There's also this big problem that, like, I think when I look at Elon's behavior and how he's sort of reconstructing Twitter, is that he maps attention very closely to physical energy. And so a lot of the design decisions that he's making are simply from creating an energetic bubble where it feeds back into itself. Like some of the first things that he did was like take away links outside. Like they tried to penalize people having a link to other platforms in the top of the thing. And now, yeah, because they want to keep you inside. And when you're only having such a short type of content, you're going to keep that attention smaller, but you want to have circumstances where it can sort of widen open to consume in more detail information. And maybe that's going to come in the future. Maybe he's 37 dimensional chess master and all it's all going to work out in the end. And there has to be a sort of energy that comes back to get them the profit that allows the platform to continue existing and allows the maintenance of the site. And so they're always sort of intrinsically connected. And I sense that we're at a sort of point similar to, when America came into being, like Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of there is evolving the replacement or the a new fundamental type of system that was once what governance was doing, except for now it's happening every second. And we've built it based off of corporate incentives, and there needs to be something like a big moment or a big document or a sense that it is fundamentally of a greater weight and importance to our society than just what it is, which is fun little social networks. And people need to understand that these systems are actually guiding democracy more than democracy is guiding them anymore. So I think that's a pretty good place to put a pin in it, especially if we lost 17 minutes of this. But this was a really good conversation.
No, don't.